Some folks have come to the channel at different times and asked me why I continue to cover the issue with the USS Fitzgerald. And for a minute, I thought that I might move on to something else because I couldn't really see anything else, and then I looked at it again and something else came out. And that's the advantages of having lots of sets of eyes and ears when you're doing an investigation. In this statement made by the captain, the 18th of June, which was the day after this happened, he took issue with a report in the Japanese press saying that he made a hard turn into the path of the destroyer. He made it very clear that he was sailing in the same direction as the destroyer. And that's right here in the article. Just wanted to make sure we don't misquote anything. Japan's public broadcaster, NHK, said the ACX Crystal had made a sharp turn shortly before the collision with the U.S. destroyer, but that account was later challenged by the ship's skipper. We were sailing in the same direction as the U.S. destroyer was and then collided, he was quoted as saying by the GG Press. Folks, what that means is when you go back to the original layout of this story on the 17th, everybody was saying the cargo ship was on autopilot, and the reason the movements that we saw was just the ship correcting to get back on autopilot. Well, we now know that's all false. We now know that he didn't find out it was a destroyer when he hit it. He didn't find out it was a destroyer 10 minutes before when he tried to avoid hitting it. He knew it was a destroyer before even that, because he said, we were sailing in the same direction as the U.S. destroyer. Now here is the critical new piece of the puzzle. When we look at this, and we've seen this 1,000 times, the Crystal and the Maquis, the only way he would have known he was sailing in the same direction as a U.S. destroyer is if he would have made visual contact with it. There's no AIS track here. He wouldn't have had that information either. They were running dark. And the only way he could have made visual contact and have had the accident, or the collision, probably more accurately described, happen is if the destroyer is running parallel with him in between the Crystal and the Maquis. Now I'm going to speed this up a little bit just to save time, and we're going to play this forward. Now, we don't see any of these ships making any kind of adjustments to deal with the Fitzgerald. There's the 120 turn right there. This is where the captain of the cargo ship said that he made a hard turn to starboard, when we can see gentle turn to port. A lot of people said, well, that was just the autopilot correcting us to stay in the channel. Wrong. Absolutely not. This was a manual turn made by Captain Advincula on the bridge, because he said in his statement that he knew he was sailing parallel with a U.S. destroyer. So he knew about him way back here. The only way he knows he's there is visual contact, because he couldn't have been on the other side of the Maquis. Wouldn't have seen him. So he's in here somewhere, running parallel with him. And then he turns toward the destroyer at this point in time. And as you can see, I'm just going to 1621 GMT is 1:20 a.m. 0120 hours local time. And here we go. And now there is the 1:30, another turn back to starboard. So at 1:20, gentle turn to port, 1:30, gentle turn back to starboard, knowing the Fitz is now somewhere in this tiny little itty-bitty area between the Crystal and the Maquis. Now, we have scale. This little white dot, we've covered this before, is 1/4 mile. So that's the distances we're talking about here. How small of a distance that is between these two tracks. So this ship captain, knowing he had a U.S. destroyer to his port, he wouldn't have turned into his path and then attempted to warn him he was turning into his path. If he didn't want to be in his path, he wouldn't have turned into it. He could have just continued, and if he thought that the two paths were going to eventually at some point cross, he could have slowed down, let the destroyer go by, he could have sped up, he could have done anything at this point, having been aware of the destroyer according to his own words. Now, there's also something else I'm going to reveal in this video, and there is a possibility that while this wasn't an accident, that both damage below and above the waterline could have happened at the same time. And I know in a lot of my videos I have said there's no way possible, but there is a new paradigm. There is a new piece of information that's been introduced, and I've found it through some digging. It goes to the shape of that bulbous bow. Now we're going to leave this here for just a second, and we're going to go to this new picture I found. Okay, now I want to show you guys something. Okay, now this is generally the same perspective as this. Let's see if I can get this right so I can go back and forth. Do you see the difference in those bows? If the Fitz got hit by the crystal, and this, when they talked about this giant protruding bulbous bow, I had always looked at this picture, assuming that's what they're talking about. And it doesn't, as you can see here, sorry about that, it doesn't protrude. It's literally almost behind this upper part here. It doesn't protrude way out. But when you go to this other picture, that does. See, if somebody showed me that picture, I'd be like, okay, well, that still doesn't explain the offset, but there is something that does explain the offset. If the Fitz was moving, 18 knots or better, and was in front of this thing turned into it, and this bow is welded on or fitted on, it's not part of the whole end, this is not all one piece, the Fitz could have ripped this thing off in the collision. In fact, it would explain a few other things too, because the Fitz hits this punctures below the waterline, and it stays in the hole. And while the Fitz continues to take the bulbous bow in one direction, the ship continues on its original course, and that's where this part could have then impacted the Fitz. And that would make sense for the offset, because something this large, of course, would have impacted first. But this is the first time I've ever seen this picture of the crystal from this perspective. And this is not this ship. I mean, it's the same ship, but this is clearly got, and it almost looks like it was, the entire thing was completely ripped off in this collision. It might be sitting at the bottom of the sea out there. And if that bow stayed in that hole, it might have, that initial puncture might have killed sailors on impact, but it would have kept enough seawater out to get those sailors out of there for just long enough before it fell back out, or this thing had a chance to back off of it. Basically, sometimes when I know they say with when you get shot with an arrow, don't pull the thing out right away, because it could be holding the blood back, and it could be the same principle here, that there's an entire huge chunk of the bow of this ship that got ripped off of the Fitz completely, or excuse me, ripped off of the crystal from the impact with the Fitz. And as you can see, I'm trying to contrast these two. That does explain it. Now, it doesn't mean that that the captain didn't turn into him on purpose, which would explain the rest of the track. Because, as we've seen, if that's the case, and the Fitz was here, and he made this turn to smack him just because he could or didn't like the U.S. Navy or for whatever reason, the motivations could be, countless. The next action here would have been normal person would have stopped. But this is not autopilot. This is none of this. And I'm still saying that, this might have been one of those things where they were just target of opportunity, had some people on board that wanted to see something like that happen, and the Maquis might have just been a great way to escape and get out of there. Now, real quick, this is 220. And I wanted to cover this before. This is when the Japanese said that the ACX Crystal called in and reported. Actually, it was 225, so I'll play a little bit farther forward. Okay, 225. The 220 time that the Admiral was talking about was a random time assigned by the Japanese Coast Guard based on the phone call at 225 from the Philippine crew, who reported that it subjectively said just happened. So that's why they just subtracted 5 minutes from the time of the phone call. It wasn't based on any evidence at all. So this is when the Crystal called back. And now, probably at this distance, might have realized that they didn't sink her. And we're coming back to maybe finish the job. Because here we're now at 2:32. This would have been 7 minutes after the call. 10 minutes after the call. And remember that ship that showed up and turned off its transponder, the Miho that we covered, is now in this region just with transponder, so the Crystal can't hit her now because there's a witness. And that Miho, I still say, that Miho is a Japanese destroyer. That female captain Japanese destroyer, so now there's somebody on site. At this point, the Japanese Coast Guard's already on the way. At this point, they're probably just trying to figure out what the hell to do. And it was a failed attack. That they tried to take the thing down, so a good investigator doesn't get attached too much to his own ideas and his own theories, but the ideas of the mines, the ideas of the ship missiles, we had to explore. Because I think at the moment, if I'm not mistaken, the North Koreans are loading anti-ship missiles onto boats. So, wouldn't have been out of the question. And I've covered extensively the Asian Navy and their use of mines. The Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, all of them do this. So that could have very well been, but with the new information, the new picture, and reanalyzing that information from right after, where he said he knew it was a destroyer. And he had been sailing alongside of the destroyer a long time before the accident, before he even tried to avoid the collision. He's saying that the destroyer turned into his path when clearly he turned toward him. The only way he could have known it was a destroyer, I'll say it again, was visually. That's how close that destroyer would have had to have been, and if he was that close visually running parallel with him, there's absolutely no excuse for a collision unless somebody was trying to hit him. And that's just the beginning and end of it. I mean, that's why you look at stuff over and over and over and over again. And I will thank you folks as much as anybody for this, because it's a lot of your comments that have made me think about things. People have mentioned about the ships being refitted with different bows. So that, would say that is not a part of the original hull. That's something that can be put on after. And if that's the case, then it's probably just welded, and that kind of an impact would rip the welds right off. The physics of it sticking way out there and then the impact. that's another piece to the puzzle. So anyway, 15 minutes, a little longer than most videos, but there was a lot to cover. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you everyone for the support. I really appreciate it, and I definitely want to hear everyone's opinion on this. It is just the most recent idea that I've had about what's going on. So like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thank you.